Let's bring in Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, international relations analyst from the University of Witwatersrand, to unpack the meeting between the developments in the Middle East war and South Africa's perspective at large. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Gilbert, and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
And thank you again for the invitation.
Prof. President Cyril
Ramaphosa. It's South Africa's attempt to follow up on the meeting in Egypt, which brought many leaders together to express their concerns about the Gaza war. And you remember that summit was also very well attended by a cross-section of world leaders. And that time it was hosted by the Egyptian president, al-Sisi. So the meeting anticipated today is simply going to pick up on some of those issues and reiterate the global concern, particularly since South Africa said last week that it's trying to mobilize a global consensus on the war in Gaza, particularly the issues around the killing of children, the escalation of the conflict into other areas in the region, particularly on the Lebanese side. And then the talk now about a potential ceasefire that is coming up and was actually started at the meeting in Egypt. So South Africa is using its position as the chair of the BRICS summit this year to bring the BRICS together, the BRICS countries together, plus the UN Secretary General. The BRICS plus the members who are invited this year, even though they are not fully members, but quite a number of them are going to show up to express concern, but also, I think, call for the urgency of a ceasefire. So that is the first component of it. And then, of course, the second component is the vote in Parliament this afternoon that is going to talk about recalling, breaking diplomatic ties with Israel. And that may also pass, because the ANC is going to support the EFF in that motion.
Well, Prof, just following those opening remarks, and thank you for that, how is this BRICS extraordinary meeting going to test BRICS nations and its unity as well? In the same breath, given the adoption or the motion that's obviously that was debated last week, and now the vote is going to happen in Parliament today, what are some of the adverse effects and consequences for South Africa at large if we look at some of the pressures that we as a country have added to Israel?
South Africa has escalated the war with Israel, the diplomatic war with Israel, and we saw the recalling of diplomats in November 6th, and then yesterday the Israelis in fact recalling their own ambassador. So South Africa has taken a very visible position on this conflict because it feels very passionately about the war. And the statements that we've seen from not just President Ramaphosa, but also the Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, they indicate that, South Africa is passionate about the war because it recalls the years of apartheid. And Israel, therefore, regarded in the same light as a country that is, in fact, oppressive, running a state, an apartheid state in Gaza. So I think that passion is there, but the consequences, as you mentioned, may be that I think the relations with the traditional Western partners is going to be damaged, I think, as a result. But I suspect that the South Africans have calculated that it doesn't really hurt to endanger relations with the U.S., particularly on issues like AGOA and so on. But what they want to do is to make a big statement globally that they need to take a leadership on this issue, because nobody else seems to be actually as visible as the South Africans are. So it's a gamble, but it probably may damage relations with traditional Western partners. And I see that coming very, very easily when we're beginning to talk next year about AGOA, it may not be renewed. I suspect that may be the consequences of these actions.
Looking at BRICS and its position, given the shifting geopolitical landscape as well, what's also coming to the fore as we look at the US and its internal dynamics, given that it also heads to the polls and some of the sentiments about what is transpiring in Israel and its support thereof, its foreign policy as well. What do you observe on that front as well?
Yeah. The shifts are very real. The U.S. is facing an election. Nobody really knows whether Biden is going to be re-elected next year because Trump has come out very strongly in the polls. So it's unclear whether the current administration will really survive. And maybe South Africa is banking on the fact that it can use these opportunities, what you may call the very weakness in the West, to do the major shift towards the East. And I think that's why the BRICS countries are now being courted much more visibly by South Africa. On the supposition that the West is getting weaker and its positions on Gaza war, for instance, we continue to show that the alignment with Israel is actually going to hurt the West in the long run because the killing of children and so on, what is happening there is being condemned very globally by all the major leaders except Western leaders. Yeah, so it's an opportune moment, I think, for South Africa to stand out and be seen to be on the right side of history and mobilize support at home and then abroad through the BRICS summit.
Prof, the summit today, the extraordinary joint BRICS meeting, follows the position adopted by South Africa, having approached the International Criminal Court to obviously issue an arrest warrant against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by mid-December, amongst many other stances at this point. And I wonder if we look at the role of BDS movements and the pressure that that's also adding to what's unfolding in the Middle East and its efficacy as well, given that time is also running out, literally as we speak.
The ICC, South Africa has made a very clear position on the ICC. They have asked the ICC to investigate war crimes against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister. It's a big gamble again because the ICC was already thinking about investigating crimes that have been committed in the Gaza Strip. So there will be a lot of pressure on the ICC, in fact, to begin the investigation. But you know that it's not as easy for the ICC to take those positions because most of its funding is actually from Western countries. So the ICC will be taking a big, big risk if it may investigate, but the question is whether it will indict Mr. Netanyahu at the end of the day because of the risks inherent in that action. But I also suspect that this summit will not back the ICC position because a lot of these countries, or South Africa's position about Mr. Netanyahu, what they may do is simply say, we condemn existing crimes that are happening. But I think that BRICS countries would want to stay away from the referral to the ICC because a lot of them are also not friends of the ICC. So they would look very compromised if they begin to ask the ICC to investigate Netanyahu. And we were not very clear that most of them were supporting the indictment of Mr. Putin when he did of Khadiagala, yes.
No, Prof, thank you for those sentiments. I also want to then look at the role of the Arab world in relation to what's unfolding and what also comes to the fore, given that some have obviously been invited to this extraordinary joint meeting.
The members who've been invited to these meetings are the members of the BRICS who will come on board next year. Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to show up. And Saudi Arabia has been very hesitant to lead on the issue around Gaza. I think you had countries like Egypt leading, and there has been criticisms internationally that the Arab countries are not as united on the war in Gaza as they should be. So I think the BRICS summit is going to give them some cover, I think, in rallying around a common international position, if we could call it this way, a common international position on a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, and probably some condemnation of what is happening there. But there's already, I think a lot of our Arab countries have condemned the action in Gaza. The only problem is, what else can they do? I don't think most of them have the stomach now to rally around a military intervention of Israel, because they don't really want to escalate that war. So I suspect what they have done is to seek cover in the BRICS countries, and maybe when they go back home, they can have another big summit of Arab countries. But I think they have had a summit already, but the problem is, what are they going to do? Is it just a question of bringing money on the table for the recovery, if we get to the recovery phase? But the war has to stop first before we begin to talk about recovery of the Gaza or the Palestinian areas in general. But a lot of these countries have the resources, and they can in fact support humanitarian recovery in Gaza.
Prof. Gilbert, Khadiagala, let's leave the conversation then. Thank you for your time with us on the SABC at this hour. International relations analyst from the University of Witwatersrand, just really unpacking the meeting between BRICS nations, of course, regarding the Middle East war.